Welcome back, everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York. And again, we're going to be continuing our 5-day-a-week, Monday through Friday broadcasts focused heavily on this new coronavirus, the CCP virus. Again, we have lawsuits and pushback against the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party's responses to some of these. We have backlash against the WHO in different efforts to try to recover the funding of the WHO. We're also going to go into some of the mysterious traits that are being found in this virus. So again, stick around. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Again, we need your support. And if you're on YouTube, click the notification bell. You get alerts when new videos are up. And also double check and make sure you're still subscribed if you have already subscribed, because we've had reports that people seem to be getting unsubscribed without their knowing. We talked before about how Missouri has this new lawsuit against the Chinese Communist Party, and notably a lawsuit against the Chinese Communist Party itself and not the Chinese government, meaning that the Chinese Communist Party is left in an interesting state where it has to either admit that it does in fact work as the main governing body of China instead of the state council, which is how it tries to masquerade, even though the state council is still under its control. And under that, then it would be able to say that it's a government and can't be sued in international court like this. Or two, it's going to have to bite the bullet and just, pretend like it's not the governing body of China and, need to take responsibility of this. But Global Times has now stepped out. Global Times is one of the Chinese Communist Party's main state-run media. It's one of the mouthpiece media. And they said, quote, "Missouri's ridiculous lawsuit against China, impossible to win." Of course, just watching how these outlets play, they're not even going to bother responding to this unless it, say, brings some level of concern to them. They're saying it's ridiculous and it's impossible to win. Very likely means that they think it can win and it's not ridiculous. So they're trying to dissuade the people from filing it, or just trying to discredit it because this is a perception thing for them as well. Also, there's now an online petition in Italy calling for people to sue the Chinese Communist Party. Actually, probably the Chinese government there. We'll have to see how that unfolds. But the Chinese Communist Party is now pushing back against Italy, saying that they are ungrateful. Because, of course, the Chinese Communist Party was doing a heavy propaganda push with its mask diplomacy into Italy. And we all know how that went. The thing largely backfired because a lot of the medical supplies they were giving were not really functional or usable. And now, on this P4 laboratory in Wuhan, this laboratory we're all hearing so much about, some of you may know France actually originally helped the Chinese Communist Party build that laboratory. And a new investigative report from Radio France is showing how France did help them initially, but how the Chinese Communist Party gradually kicked them out of that whole project. And of course, those of you who saw the documentary I made investigating the origins of the Wuhan coronavirus, I, of course, explained some of the history of that. And yes, it's true. The Chinese Communist Party did push out France over time, and actually France became very concerned over time about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party's, interest in that laboratory. And we also mentioned that the company the Chinese Communist Party brought in to take over the building of the lab actually had ties to the Chinese military, the PLA. Interesting turn of events. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on April 22nd called on the Chinese Communist Party to close these wet markets, these wild animal markets, given the fact that, of course, in the original narrative, the Chinese Communist Party was claiming the virus began at this Huanan seafood market, this wet market. And so Pompeo called them out and said, called them to close these markets, said that markets like that, where you have all these wild animals in close proximity to humans and to each other, there's a lot of risk of infection with different viruses. So the Chinese Communist Party has responded. I'll just read it to you. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang said, quote, "There is no such thing as a wild animal wet market in China. China does not have the concept of a wet market." All right. Anyway, this comes right after Notably, the Chinese Communist Party reopened. I can't say the party did it, but China reopened these wet markets. Just recently, right after Wuhan reopened. In fact, they reopened the wet markets. So you heard it here. Apparently, China does not. There's no such thing as wet markets in China, and which is interesting. Actually, I like this narrative. I like the idea they're saying these wet markets don't exist because it raises the question of where the virus came from. The Chinese Communist Party can no longer claim it comes from a wet market. There's no such thing as wet markets in China. So I think we should stick with this, personally. Some news updates in the United States. The Daily Caller is reporting that a new addition to the Paycheck Protection Program will largely bar big companies from taking advantage of the virus bailout. And of course, this is the loan program for businesses that they made. Now, the guidance itself states, quote, "It is unlikely that a public company with substantial market value and access to capital markets will be able to make the required certification in good faith, and such a company should be prepared to demonstrate to SBA, the group handling it, upon request, the basis for its certification." And the PPP, the name of the Paycheck Protection Program, rule states that if a company knowingly violates this, it could result in a 30-year prison sentence and a $1 million fine. And also in its rules, it requires these companies to have fewer than 500 employees, and about 75% of the relief needs to go into expenses around payroll. Of course, this does challenge some of the narratives that were being spread that this, bailout was just going to benefit big corporations and things like that. Maybe parts of it will, very likely, but at least this Paycheck Protection Program will not. Now, moving on, New York City and New York State. Now, Cuomo came out, Governor Cuomo, and said the antibody tests they're doing show that close to 2.7 million people in New York State may have been infected with the virus. Now, this is based on 3,000 tests they gave, so of course they didn't test 2.7 million people or something like that. They're taking the estimate of that and applying it to the entire New York population. Now, this is, again, based on tests of close to 3,000 people done in stores across 19 New York counties. And based on this, they believe that in New York City, about 21% of people have tested positive, and about 13.9% overall in New York State have tested positive. Now, this was done with antibody testing, not on testing for the virus itself, because they claim that doing antibody testing can better detect cases where the virus isn't really showing symptoms in the body. Now, personally, tests like this, I take them kind of with a grain of salt. It's nice to get some updates in terms of having some data to look at. I know if I'm going to the marketplace, I think there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not going to sit down and let someone, test me for antibodies. I would assume that most people getting tested are people who are concerned that they may have it. Again, that's my analysis. Maybe, people just feel like getting tested for antibodies. I don't know. Take it for what it is. In other words, it is a piece of data we can use to try to figure out how many cases there are in New York. So it is something to go on. And to the WHO, the World Health Organization, which we've been hearing so much about. Now, the Australian Prime Minister is saying that all members of the WHO should seek an investigation into the pandemic. I noted in the previous episode that he had phone calls with several national leaders, including Trump, about calling for an international investigation into the Chinese Communist Party and into the WHO and its involvement with this cover-up, by basically repeating what the Chinese Communist Party has said. Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is criticizing the WHO for not getting crucial data on the virus from China. Now the WHO, in other words, is not just being criticized for covering up on behalf of China, but is also being criticized for not being, serving its role in being independent and making an effort to get accurate data out of China, including crucial data that we don't currently have about this virus, which we'll get into in a bit. And he said that the U.S. may never again finance the WHO. It is the World Health Organization's responsibility to achieve that transparency. In other words, achieve that level of transparency with China around a pandemic when they have data on it they're not sharing. He said, quote, "They're not doing it. They need to be held accountable," referring to the WHO. And what's been great is to see other countries around the world begin to recognize the WHO failures as well. And he adds, quote, "It may be the case that the United States can never return to underwriting, having U.S. taxpayer dollars go to the WHO." So, given that the United States was giving about 400 million to 500 million a year to the WHO, of course, the WHO has been trying to recover some of these finances, and different organizations and countries are trying to help it get those finances back. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has announced that it will now give the WHO $30 million. And of course, this is in response to the U.S. putting the freeze on the WHO's funding. And China, of course, typically gives up to $40 million a year to the WHO. And at the same time, the WHO held a fundraiser concert with Global Citizen called One World Together at Home. It was frontlined by Lady Gaga. It was a 6-hour digital stream, then 2 hours of philanthropists and world leaders speaking. Actually, Chinese networks, social media networks, and just about every major U.S. broadcaster broadcasted it. Now, it ended up raising about $175 million and had about 270 million viewers that included about 20.7 million in the United States. It's not clear if all 175 million will go to the WHO, but if we combine that with the money from the Chinese Communist Party, it brings it to about half or less than half of the money they're losing from the United States putting a hold on its budget. And now back to this faulty medical equipment. The saga continues. Canada, they bought 1 million respirators from China, and they found that these respirators are unfit to fight against the coronavirus. Now, they ordered these K9-ND6 respirators that they purchased from China and found that these cannot defend people from the virus, leaving again their healthcare workers on the front lines at risk of infection. And seemingly unaware of such things, California Governor Gavin Newsom is being criticized right now for spending close to $1 billion in taxpayer money to buy protective masks from a Chinese car manufacturer. And already he's paid the first installment of that, which was $495 million. Given the way this has gone for other countries, we can imagine how this may go. Who knows, maybe this Chinese car manufacturer knows what it's doing, unlike the rest of these Chinese companies. We'll have to see how this one unfolds as well. Now, on to the mysterious nature of this virus. Now, it should be stated first off that we don't actually know a whole lot about this virus still. Countries are kind of having to figure it out by themselves, mainly because the Chinese Communist Party, which was the epicenter of the virus in Wuhan, and which was dealing with it long before most other countries were, has more data on it, we assume, than in any other country, and they have not been sharing that data with other countries. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called them out for this, noting that the Chinese Communist Party is continuing to block U.S. scientists from entering China to study the coronavirus. Even today, the Chinese government hasn't permitted American scientists to go to China, to go into not only the Wuhan lab or wherever it needs to learn about this virus, to learn about its origins. And he adds that, quote, "Look, we know it began at one," referring in context of the lab. "But we need to figure this out. There's an ongoing pandemic. We still don't have the transparency and openness we need in China." Now, a couple interesting things about this. One is the fact that he said, "We know it began in one." Is this finally a very strong and direct statement that the U.S. government knows this came from a Chinese laboratory? And two, he notes that the Chinese Communist Party has been blocking American scientists from actually going there and studying the virus. And this again goes into some of the other weird things that scientists here and doctors here have been encountering with the virus and are having to learn on the ground what to do about it. There was a story in the Washington Post noting that there's a mysterious blood clotting complication that is killing many patients who get this virus. There have been reports that it destroys not just the lungs, but it appears just all around the body. It's a very bizarre virus. Now, they're saying in the biggest hospital in New York City, about 88% of virus patients on ventilators have perished. And of course, the news we had coming out of China was that people who had the virus in its more severe forms, the one whose lives were actually at risk, had to be put on ventilators. But apparently the ventilators themselves aren't even doing it. In fact, yeah, again, Washington Post, 88% of virus patients on ventilators have perished. And now on to one last one that I think a lot of us can relate to, because I've seen a lot of people joking about it, and I know I joked about it with some of my friends, is that we all seem to be losing track of time. The days are merging into each other. Saturday feels like Monday, Monday feels like Friday. It's an interesting state we're in. But according to a neuropsychologist, Molly Calvin, this is apparently normal during situations or odd situations like this. As she wrote in WBUR stating that, quote, the cognitive changes associated with acute stress may be overlooked but are no less significant. Our full attentional resources are deployed to transform our cognitive and sensory powers into laser beams that search for and analyze threats. Anything of lesser importance is suppressed from awareness. Time warps so that the present movement is elongated. Complex thinking skills like decision making or planning temporarily go offline. So if you feel that your sense of time, your ability to schedule things, and your ability to make decisions and plan are being affected, well, join the party. Apparently a lot of people are having that right now. Now, that said, folks, again, we're going to be continuing these broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Actually, coming up, I'm going to start doing interviews again. Have a few different ones lined up. I'll let you know when they're confirmed. Also going to be trying to branch out a bit into some other types of content, some more in-depth analysis, that kind of thing. I think you'll like it. Let me know what you think of it. That said, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell if you're on YouTube. Again, we need your support. And again, if you have already subscribed, double check and make sure you're still subscribed. Of course, folks, questions, things you want to let me know, leave it in the comments section. I do read them. And again, Mondays I'll be reading some of the comments, answering some questions on the show. So again, please take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. We'll see you next time.